Welcome to this breakout session, Mitigating Fraud Risk in Times of Uncertainty. I'm Margot Cella, Vice President for Research and Anti-Fraud Initiatives at the Center for Audit Quality. The CAQ is an autonomous public policy organization that's dedicated to enhancing investor confidence and public trust in the global capital markets. We bring together key stakeholders to advance discussion of critical issues requiring action and intervention. We're a founding member of the Anti-Fraud Collaboration, which includes the Financial Executives International, the Institute for Internal Auditors, and the National Association of Corporate Directors, what we consider to be the key members of the financial reporting supply chain. Our overall mission is to facilitate the deterrence and detection of fraud risk through efforts that are aimed at increasing the effectiveness of participants along the financial reporting supply chain. We develop resources such as white papers, case studies, webcasts, etc., that will help our members increase their awareness of some of the risks that we all face. The CAQ is proud to be a silver sponsor of ECI's IMPACT 2020. I hope you've been able to visit our team at our virtual exhibit booth and check out our free resources. I'm sure you'll agree with me that these past 3 days have provided some great keynotes and breakout sessions. Today, I'll be having a conversation with Holly Tucker, who is a partner in the forensic practice of Deloitte Financial Advisory Services. Holly, please introduce yourself.
Great, thank you, Margot. Just a quick introduction, and happy to be here today with all of you virtually. My name is Holly Tucker. I'm a partner in the forensic practice of Deloitte based out of Dallas. I've been with Deloitte for almost 22 years. And the last 15 or so spent my practice and career really focused on anything proactive and reactive related to fraud, corruption, and regulatory compliance. I lead our forensic practice from a consumer industry perspective, as well as leading our clients and impacts and co-leading our anti-fraud consulting practice. So really happy to be here with everyone today on what we believe is going to be a very timely and exciting topic, and certainly look forward to hearing your questions. We're going to try to answer those throughout the course of our discussion.
Thank you. So today we'll be covering the following topics. We'll first talk about the impact of the current crisis on fraud risks. Then we'll move into the areas of consideration that are impacting that fraud during the crisis. And finally, we'll discuss mitigating and managing the fraud risks that are apparent. We'll be answering your questions, as Holly mentioned, and we have a few polling questions, so we'll want you all to participate in that as well. So let's kick this off by talking about some of the business risks that COVID-19 is having on organizations. Holly, what are you seeing from your clients, and what have you seen transpire over the past couple of months? And what are some of the implications from a fraud perspective?
Yeah, thank you. So you certainly can see the things here on the slides, and I'm not necessarily going to read through that. I think that certainly what we're seeing is a lot of concern around fraud. Even before kind of at the start of this crisis, it is something that at least we in the industry, and I think many of you may have been concerned about. We add on then the continuing crisis. We add on the CARES package and program and the stuff that's coming out from that. And what we're seeing is really a lot of just interest and concern around how are we going to manage and mitigate this. In some instances, organizations are in survival mode. This is really kind of a make it or break it time. It's been a challenge. Certain industries are really feeling kind of a double whammy. And so it's really, the questions we're getting on what should we focus on now? What is our most immediate need? Help us think through what are other organizations concerned about. If we're a recipient of funds, there's certainly concerns and questions around that. So I think that, it's just bringing uncertainty. We'll talk through, Margot, kind of some of the changes in the workforce and how that impacts the risk of fraud, whether it is everyone, of course, moving to a remote workforce. There's changes in workforce dynamics. There's a lack of maybe access. Some companies are probably maybe more agile than others for a variety of reasons on going remote. And so there's impacts to that. And all of that really leads to a heightened risk of fraud, waste, and abuse within an organization.
Okay, great. Yeah, so let's turn to our first polling question just to get a sense from our audience. if they've experienced some of these effects already. So here's the question. Has COVID-19 had an impact on your ethics and compliance program and activities and/or the company's fraud risk management programs? So while we're waiting for the polling results, Holly, what are some of the impacts that you think ethics and compliance officers should be looking out for?
Well, I think that one of the things that I think is going to be impactful and something to be really looking for is, where do we want to spend our time now? Now is not the time. I think most people would agree, but now is not the time probably to revamp an entire fraud risk management program. It's not the time maybe to do some of the, and some people may, think otherwise, but do some of maybe the enhancements that were planned. I think where, time is spent in what you as ethics compliance officers and/or those charged with responsibility of the fraud risk management program should be focusing is understanding what the current environment is going to do to your program. Do you have new risks that have presented themselves? Again, we talk about some of the federal programs. How are you going to handle that? What are the risks and challenges to your internal controls? Have you considered that? There's going to be an uptick in fraudsters. They are always out there. This is, an opportunity for them, quite honestly. We've already seen a significant increase in phishing schemes. I think there will be an increase in cyber attacks. We expect to see, a significant amount of fraud, waste, and abuse within stimulus funds, both from probably the start from an application through to how do we spend it. There's a lot to be thinking about, but I think it's really taking a risk-based approach to what is the most critical thing that we need to think about that's new, and the most critical things that we need to maintain, that we cannot take our eye off of. Because when we think about opportunity and rationalization, and we all love the fraud triangle, those things are going to present themselves. And so it's really figuring out, where is it going to present itself? Where do we think they're going to attack? And what are we going to do to try to mitigate the risk?
Yeah, so looking at the polling results, it looks like 58% have. The COVID-19 has had an impact on their either E&C programs or their fraud risk programs. And many of the things that you were talking about were risks from the outside, from cyber attacks and from phishing schemes. What about from inside the company?
Great segue. Absolutely. I think that when we start to see the pressure internally, the pressure that management and the organization is under to, maybe preserve the earnings of the company, to preserve the business, we expect to see an increase in fraud and corruption internally, whether it is we need to falsify certain records from a financial reporting perspective to make sure that we look good to our investors so that we don't get downgraded. We expect to see an uptick in disclosure fraud with companies not properly disclosing in their filings the true impact and where their organizations are at. That, of course, we'll talk a little bit about some of the lag times. Some of these frauds may not present themselves for a while. 3 months, maybe to 9 months or 12, depending upon year ends and when you're filing. But I do think they will absolutely present themselves. I think the other thing that's important to think about is what individual employees are feeling with pending, likely, maybe layoffs, furloughs, changing of jobs, decrease in pay, changes in the work structure during the week. You're going to start to have employees that feel that they are becoming desperate. Maybe their pay has been decreased, and desperate times call for desperate measures, unfortunately. And I think this is when really good people sometimes start to make bad choices because they feel there's no other way. That could be theft of inventory, misappropriation of assets. It could be theft of cash. It could be falsification of companies to try to get money out. I saw a question come in around, are we seeing an uptick or are people concerned about an uptick in fraud related to records falsification and time management? Absolutely, I think we're going to see that. I think we're going to see an increase in fraud around just payroll fraud in general? Are there ghost employees? We're going to see an increase in third-party fraud. I think we'll see an increase in corruption, especially because, we've got the lack of, or we're all on unrestricted travel right now. And so many of our organizations and many of you are global. And so I think the increase of corruption will be there as well as companies look to gain those contracts. And how are we going to get the business? I think we'll see significant uptick.
Great. So, earlier we were talking about taking the stimulus money. The last month, the government passed a $2 trillion stimulus package, and another one that's probably going to get passed today. What should companies be thinking about if they're going to be taking that money? I would imagine documentation is a big issue, but what kinds of things should companies be doing to make sure that they're on the straight and narrow if they're taking money?
Yeah, now I will preface this and say I'm not an expert on the program, but I have spent the better part of my career focused on fraud, and so and certainly I'm working with people across our firm to learn more about it, but I think there's a few things that people should be focusing on. You mentioned the first one, Margot, which is really around the documentation, the controls, the compliance with regards to the receipt of funds is going to be critical. There are requirements around documenting that, how you're going to spend it, when you're going to spend it, how you're going to spend it. I think maintaining records to really validate is going to be critical. We expect to see, even from an operational and programmatic perspective, I think there's going to be increased risk. There may be policies and controls in place right now that really are not sufficient to address this. And so you've got some legacy considerations. How are we quickly going to pivot and get some policies, procedures, SOPs, whatever it may be in place to help us manage and mitigate this? Resources is going to be a challenge. Many organizations are really struggling with resources, again, for some of the workforce things we talked about, but also because in many instances, it's all hands on deck. I've talked to a lot of clients within, legal and compliance, internal audit, and the focus is shifting very quickly to maybe some of the things that we traditionally do that appear now to be nice to haves, we're not focused on. We are all focused on, whatever the 2 or 3 main things are, and we see organizational shifts. What that does, though, is put a strain on resources. And so I think that's going to be a critical element of how we manage these funds. When we think about the integrity of the stimulus package itself and the program integrity, it's really around, we do expect to see, and again, this is based on history, higher error rates, a reduced emphasis on the prevention. And so it's like we got to get the money out, and then it's a pay and chase scenario that companies will find themselves in, which is, that was not right. Now we got to go get it back. So because, again, resources have shifted. Maybe everyone's not on the prevention. It came out very quickly. Applications went in fast. I mean, we all saw how quickly, at least for small business, the funds were disseminated. I don't really gamble or bet, but I would bet that there were falsified applications. There was falsified payroll to be qualified for those sorts of things. We're going to see new types of fraud come up. We're really not sure what they're going to look like. They will present themselves. We're going to see more bad actors. Again, this is a perceived opportunity. When you put $2 trillion plus flowing out very quickly, there is going to be fraud. And so those are just a few things. I mean, as we think about, as companies kind of grapple with that, I think there's really those 3 areas. It's operational. What are we going to do around that? From a program perspective, what do we need to be doing? What do we have in place that can help us? What do we need to create and get quickly up to speed? And then from the integrity of the funds themselves, what are we doing from a documentation perspective? How are we ensuring that we're spending it appropriately and that we're doing it within the confines of the package?
Mm-hmm. So are there particular groups inside the company that the compliance professionals should be certain to ask questions of and stay connected with, just to sort of tamp down any potential abuse of the stimulus money?
Well, I think stimulus and then beyond just regular fraud, absolutely. In many organizations, the ethics compliance officer may have the overall ownership of the fraud risk management program. But there's many other important stakeholders: finance, risk management, legal, internal audit, HR. So I think that, like with any significant fraud risk, there's going to need to be a lot of coordination. I think that oftentimes is the challenge when something happens so quickly and our environment is changing so fast. It's getting our arms around how do we handle this? What's the most important thing? And who are we talking to? I think that you want to ensure, to the extent possible and as quickly as possible, that the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. So coordination across that, I think from an operations perspective, that's important. There's tax considerations, that's important. There's a lot of stakeholders in this when we think about the stimulus package, but just beyond that from a fraud perspective.
Great. Okay, so now I want to switch to some of the areas of consideration that will impact fraud during the crisis. This is slide 5. Let's talk about these in particular, Holly, in whatever order you think is correct.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of maybe start. I just talked about where we see some of that increased pressure. So maybe we'll start with kind of where that manifests itself. As I look through this, probably some of that pressure is going to manifest itself in the financial reporting. And I would say financial reporting, liquidity, going concern, those are all kind of interrelated. From a, like I said, we expect to see financial reporting increasing. Why? Well, it could be because we have liquidity issues, or we are not sure kind of how long we're going to make it. And maybe there's that pressure internal that they have the feeling that they're going to record some things, not show the full impact of it in an attempt to, save the company, or, we're going to come out of this. Now, this environment is different. We have not gone through this before. I've lived, I'm sure many of us on the phone, I was doing this back during 9/11, during the 2008 crisis, during the previous recessions. This is different. So I think, many companies, fraud or not, are going to be grappling with liquidity and going concern. But what that does is it increases pressure on people. And again, I mentioned it earlier, desperate times call for desperate measures. And sometimes that calls for, it doesn't call for, but it leads to people making some really bad decisions, which kind of leads us to that ethical misconduct. Mm-hmm. And we'll touch on some of this. We expect to see an uptick in ethical misconduct, and that can run the gamut. It could be from workplace violence. I would expect maybe to see that. We're certainly seeing an uptick in the non-workplace from that perspective, which is, is sad and just given all the stress that people are under. But I think that may be something we see. I think we'll see an uptick in just our general theft, the different schemes on ways to get money out the door. We expect to see, as I mentioned earlier, an uptick around dealing with third parties, whether that's, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, whether it's an FCPA violation or whether it's just kind of local and domestic. But I would expect to see an uptick on that where people are saying, hey, we got to make a deal. So I'll give you this, you give me that, whatever that may be. Workforce, that's another one. We talked a little bit about that. Workforce and internal controls somewhat go together. When we see a displaced workforce, such as what we're seeing, again, I mentioned that, all the different ways, whether it's furloughed, whether it's changing my responsibilities, whether there's been layoffs and now I'm doing the jobs of 3 people. Oftentimes, internal controls don't catch up or are not being updated alongside all the different changes that are happening in the workplace. So let's think about a few of them, right? Delegation of authority. That's a huge control, and it's a huge anti-fraud control. When we see people shifting, are you able to maintain that delegation of authority? Manual controls. How are you mitigating some of those risks where there's manual controls in place where you're not physically in the same place? And so companies are quickly having to think about that. System access. That's important on a number of levels. Certainly those of you, there's SOX controls. Each of those are SOX controls for those of you that are public filers. But there are also significant anti-fraud controls. And when we start to see that displacement and the workforce is disrupted, access to systems may change. I may actually have access to, the ability now because of whatever happened. Maybe my colleague is no longer doing this, where I have access to the accounts payable system. So maybe I'm a processor and I can approve payments going out, but typically I did not have the ability to add suppliers, vendors, or third parties to the AP system. Maybe now I do. Well, what does that lead to? A significant increase in fraud, because when you have access to those two, you have access keys to the kingdom, and that's a significant way that money is going out in an organization. Disclosure fraud, financial reporting disclosure, we've mentioned that. We expect to see an uptick in that, where there is, we're not showing the full picture from a financial perspective, where we are not maybe reporting our contingencies correctly, where we are not accruing for things that we know that are coming. And what that leads to then is obviously inquiries from the regulators, upset shareholders, shareholder lawsuits, and so on and so forth. You can kind of look down the road and see what some of these impacts are going to have. And then,
so the public companies are supposed to be disclosing in their filings what impact they think COVID will have on their future earnings and those sorts of things, correct?
That's right. Absolutely. And then from a culture perspective, the culture erosion, culture is so important in the fight against fraud. And it's really something that should be on the front lines of your fraud risk management program. Again, when we see all these things happen, it may be time to step back and say, what is the impact of this on our culture? What are we doing to appropriately mitigate that? Are we getting messaging out there? Are we being forthright with our employees? Are we being transparent on the impact to the organization? All these things can have a positive benefit to the culture, even when it's in very trying times. And so when we see that culture erode, when we start to not hear anything from management, that's when, again, all these other things start to rise up a little bit. No news is not good news during times.
So even if the management team is sort of scrambling to figure out what they're supposed to be doing in terms of their financial reporting or business operations or whatever, it's still important for them to be communicating with their teams and pushing down their culture, values, and messages.
Absolutely.
Correct?
Ethical messaging is one of those things, as I mentioned earlier. This is a time to really step back and go, what do we need to maintain right now, right? What must we continue to do as we navigate this path, even though we're focused maybe more operationally? We've got internal control considerations. But as you step back and consider what's most critical, I think ethical messaging and continuing to have that transparency from the top is critical.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to our second polling question, which is what best describes your greatest fraud-related concern during this crisis? And while we're getting our responses in, I think we've talked a little bit about the CARES already, but what are some of the cyber risks that you think are things that people should be looking out for?
Yeah, so I am, again, I'll preface this, I'm not a cyber specialist.
Right.
But
I'm sure most of our E&C people aren't either. So
that's right. But cyber and fraud go hand in hand.
Yes.
And so, certainly, as I mentioned earlier, an uptick in some of the schemes. But I think the cyber, when I speak with my cyber colleagues, some of the risks that they're discussing certainly are this quick and rapid shift to remote workforce. And really trying to figure out, do we have the security controls in place that we need to, with everyone working remotely, accessing our systems remotely, doing all of our business remotely? So I think the security control component is critical. And I would, assume that in many of your organizations, that's top of mind, which is how do we kind of lock down some of the stuff that maybe we've not had to think about before to ensure our employees aren't doing things that they're not supposed to, but certainly to try to help mitigate against the risk of an external attack. So cyber is certainly critical during this time.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned the phishing earlier. Our company about 6 months ago went into, I'm sure many companies have this, but every email that we get from outside, it says this is not from an internal person. So we hopefully can avoid those kind of phishing things where somebody says to the, an accounting clerk, hey, I need you to write me a check for $100,000 and pay this vendor, which happens to be me. But so we can sort of try to avoid those, and that's a simple fix, or a simple. I shouldn't call it a fix. I should call it a deterrent. So it looks like we have some results in cyber. Of course, probably 60% of the folks thought that was said that their greatest concern. But some are also concerned about third-party risk management and asset misappropriation. So talk a little bit about third-party risk management and why that's a challenge.
Yeah, so, third-party risk management during these times presents a number of challenges. One, from a financial viability perspective, or supply chain resiliency. How much are we relying on third parties? How critical are they to our supply chain? And I think a lot of organizations are really quickly trying to get a handle of that. If a third party, goes bankrupt or ceases to operate, what is the impact on the organization? From a fraud perspective, certainly, I think it's also, we talked a little bit ago about it. We do expect to see, it could be that third parties are going to look to defraud you. It could be that there's collusion within the organization and there's kickbacks. I think we'll see an increase in that. But from a supply chain perspective, and I think it really also depends upon what your supply chain looks like. So our consumer companies, right, the board, whether it's retail, consumer products, TH&S, supply chain is absolutely critical. And there's certainly an uptick in the inquiries and the things that are happening there. So again, companies can get a handle around what does this look like and what's the near-term, mid-term, and long-term impact to our business based upon our supply chain. Absolutely big one. Asset misappropriation. Yeah. That's the other one you mentioned, Margot. When people feel that there's an increased opportunity or they feel they have no other kind of means, they're seeing their household income dry up. They're seeing just, all sorts of things happen. We start to see an uptick in fraud. And when we think about asset misappropriation, there's numerous schemes. Again, it depends upon the organization, but it's those physical assets that are going out the door, whether it's inventory, whether it's cash via AP, whether it's cash via payroll, whether it's cash via, just other means. I think that's just a huge area. It may not have as great of an impact from a financial statement perspective, but if we kind of go back to the morale and the culture and the people side of things, even if there's a lot of little frauds, we start to see a little bit of erosion from that perspective. So not surprising that's of concern as well.
Yeah. And, while less than a quarter think financial reporting and disclosure frauds are an issue, I suspect certainly in the first couple of quarters, they might be small frauds, small sort of misinterpretation or misestimation of some of the assets, the valuations, et cetera, or again, somebody sort of tweaking the books just a little bit to make the company look better. Maybe they're being altruistic, but it could be one of those things that they'll think, oh, you know what, this will be over by Q2 or Q3, so we'll be able to make up whatever I'm saying we did this time. But, based on the news this morning, Q2, it may not be over. We may be going into Q3. So these things, while you might not be worried about them now, could be snowballing or coming down that slippery slope.
Yeah. And again, that's an area that's right. And so I think that's not probably surprising that may not be top of mind because it's something that's further out. I do think it's coming. Time will tell. But history has shown us that is certainly a risk. And that whether it is capitalizing, again, some of these are not the most sophisticated schemes. Capitalize expenses to the balance sheet, right? To try to protect that bottom line. We've seen companies fail, right? Big time over that scheme alone. Falsifying sales, not recording the contingency. If you've got a huge accrual and you're not recording it, that impacts bottom line. failure to impair assets when you know they're going to be impaired and not appropriately going through that process or falsifying that to avoid some of those charges. There's lots of different ways that it can happen. And the disclosure piece is we may have everything buttoned up from a financial perspective, but what we're telling people is a different story. And so, again, not surprising. That one, I do believe, is further out. We've got a ways to go. But I think, that is one that will lag and probably at some point present itself.
So I have to confess that I am a little bit technically challenged, so I have lost access to the Q&A box. So if there's some questions in there that you think we should address at this point before moving on.
Yeah, so let me see. There's a couple questions in here. Let's see if I can address these real time. I'm also a little bit technically challenged. Full disclosure for all of you there, I think we're all, this remote environment and doing everything Zoom, I may have some things in the background with kids and dogs here. So appreciate everyone's patience. There was one question that came in around, is there communication from professional organizations to encourage companies to have a true and accurate reporting even now to mitigate their fear of loss of confidence by investors, shareholders? Any insider advice on how this should be addressed with COVID? So I'm not sure exactly from a professional organization perspective where this question is coming from, but I would say just from a requirement, right? We're thinking about financial reporting. You absolutely, we always should have true and fair financial reporting. And I think now more than ever, it's going to be critical that we're really, really doing that. Hopefully everyone always is. From a care perspective, I think it's really going to be critical that you know what money you got, where it's going, how it was spent, and that you have appropriate records for that because there is heightened risk.
I should say that the CAQ, whose our URL, our website is www.thecaq.org, has been compiling some really good COVID resources on accounting and auditing issues. We also have some anti-fraud resources. So if you go to our website, you can go to the COVID page. We also have links to things that the regulators have been putting out, the SEC and the PCAOB, which is the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, as well as links back to the websites for our 8 governing board forums, which are Deloitte, Ernst & Young, PwC, KPMG, BDO, Grant Thornton, Crowe, and RSM. So there's a wealth of information, and that's a great place to start.
Yeah, when I see professional organizations, those are others. You're absolutely right. From a regulator perspective, there is going to be there is already information out there on what companies need to be thinking about from a disclosure and a reporting perspective. So absolutely, SEC is putting out stuff. There's a lot of materials out there on various websites. We have a whole website dedicated that you can go and look to depending upon, where you sit in the organization. But if you're getting stuff from a CFO and a reporting perspective, I would definitely tap into those because the SEC is definitely putting things out and there are going to be requirements specific to COVID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's even important for compliance officers to go to even professional organizations that are not ethics and compliance so that they know what their fellow C-suite members are worried about and needing to deal with. So anything else before we move on?
I'm looking here. Oh gosh, here's one. It's a good question. We'll answer it. Regarding the potential, and I'll preface again, not legal, but regarding the potential for an increase in fraudulent financial or falsified corporate filings, to what extent do you think the personal liability that CFOs face may serve to deter companies from engaging in such fraud? I don't think that the CFO's liability or any other executive's personal liability is going to change. There are requirements and certainly considerations from a 404 perspective within Sarbanes-Oxley and others. Hopefully that would deter it. But I don't know. There's not going. Those requirements and the liability and kind of what they're certifying and and what is on the line for to certify, that hasn't changed. That's not going to change.
Right.
Hopefully, that will continue to deter inappropriate activity. But again, history has shown us that sometimes that's not enough.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And even though the SEC has, extended some filing deadlines, it doesn't mean you don't have to do what you would have had to do if you had filed on time.
That's right. That's right.
So let's move to mitigating and managing fraud risks. With everything that's going on, how should companies approach the mitigating of
with
these
all this
emerging
bad
risks?
news now, what do you do about it?
Exactly. Like, where should they focus?
Yeah. So again, a lot of you are involved probably in your widespread organizational response. You're being tapped from a crisis management perspective. You're being tapped to, many of you actually probably report into legal. You're part of that team. You're helping. We've got kind of three areas here. Crisis management, very broad term, a lot of things that are happening within that. Strong leadership, and then, of course, culture of compliance. So when we think about crisis management, there is a lot to be learned from historical issues. I think a lot of people are finding that they had what they thought were really good plans, continuity and from a crisis management, and those are getting stress tested right now. So I think leveraging lessons learned from the past is a critical one. I think really making sure that you all as E&C professionals are involved in that response. We talked a little bit earlier about the need to really step back and think, what is the most critical thing for our organization? Crisis management is a response across a number of things. It's operational, it's people, it's compliance, it's regulatory, it's financial. It's how are we dealing and mitigating with all those factors, which, sadly, every single one of those is going to be impacted by this pandemic. The other thing that I think is important, and I've mentioned this, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but it's to really, focus on the foundational elements and focus on the most critical areas of your program that you really just can't take your eye off the ball. As I mentioned at the very beginning, now is not the time, and I don't think anyone is, but just to, get it out there, it's probably not the time to design and implement a whole new fraud risk management program. But it is the time to really think about what must we continue? What is critical? What is table stakes for us and whomever in our organization that is responsible for the fraud risk management program? What must we maintain? That's that messaging, which kind of gets to the third one there, the culture of compliance.
Right.
Some of that is the ongoing monitoring. There are certain things that we need to continue to monitor. When we think about our whistleblower hotlines and our speak up lines, those things have to continue. People are going to report stuff. And in fact, I think you would see a significant intake, an uptick in the number of claims. I've talked to clients and they said they're getting a lot of calls for various things, probably across the different pillars that I just rattled off. Investigations must happen. Inquiries must be made. So those sorts of things must continue. They are just going to maybe look different. Remote investigations. How do you do those? I know a lot of people are not comfortable with that. There's a lot of things from a legal perspective and the attorneys that I talk to around interviewing remotely and kind of will that stand up and those sorts of things. And these are maybe some of the bigger matters. But that's something to consider, but you can't not do them. I mean, I think
even yesterday, Sally Yates was saying that, if a company has an issue, they have to do these things. And the DOJ and the AUSAs and SEC understand that these have to be done remotely. And I think Deloitte even has a publication on that. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we do. We've put out a number of points of view and various placemats and stuff just to kind of give people a sense of the things of really some of what we've talked about here today. Remote investigations is one of them. And it's really just figuring out all the way from, how do we allocate and designate who's going to do the investigation? What sort of data can we collect remotely? How are we going to collect and do our digital forensics, whether it's imaging or getting server backups or mobile device? I mean, we do that remotely. That can be done. The interviews, of course, can be done remotely. So it's just a whole, it's just a consideration around what should I be thinking about? one of the things we're looking at is a follow-up on that to kind of get more into this is what we think about, and now how do you do it? Mm-hmm. But absolutely, I think those sorts of things have to go on. The ethical messaging we talked about earlier, it should continue. Maybe now more than ever, to really continue to say, look, we're in this together. We as management, hopefully this is true, right, are maintaining, that tone at the top, and we expect people to make good choices, and we're here for you. You may have, one thing you may want to create is a different way in which people are able to reach out for help. Maybe it's more around the wellness side of things and ensuring that there's appropriate resources on that side of the house, so that people start to feel the stress, and they're starting to feel the impacts of this. They're starting to feel being isolated. That's when some of these bad decisions could happen. And so again, having those sorts of things, that may be something that you all are working on from ethics compliance. All of that has a fraud angle. Mm-hmm. Really, I think we talked about that gets into strong leadership. Of course, the well-being I just touched on. The safe workplace environment, I think that's always a concern, especially, in the last decade or so, we've seen a significant uptick in workplace issues. Right now, most of us, not all, we've got people on the front lines, and they are in the workplace. And I would, I have the luxury, quite honestly, of working from my house right now. I'm sitting at my kitchen table. Not everyone is doing that. There are plants and facilities and manufacturing operations that must go on, and the stress and the changes and how that's happening impacts the workplace. And so that's critical. And certainly where ethics compliance professionals can work with your HR organizations and operations to really think through those. And then the culture of compliance, we've touched on that quite a bit.
Right.
Just an opportunity to continue to emphasize that, because it is so important on mitigating these risks.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk a little bit, future work. But let's turn to our third polling question, because this is, how long from now do you envision focusing on your fraud risk management program to mitigate the current crisis and the risks that may be associated with it? And Holly, I'll ask you, what are some of the tools that ethics and compliance teams make available to employees to enhance the company's compliance and fraud risk programs?
Well, I think that certainly from a tool perspective, it's some of what we talked about, the policies and the procedures. I think the providing and increasing the opportunities to report things. The hotline is going to be critical. Providing some of those well-being things. There's a lot of different, and again, these are not just owned by ethics and compliance. I think this is one of those times where maybe now more than ever, where the various, in some, siloed or different businesses, really have to come together from a leadership perspective to think about what employees need during this time. There's a bunch of, certainly a bunch of different things, and each organization is going to look a little bit different. But I think really kind of, again, having that, stepping back, taking that risk-based approach, and really understanding what we need, and then figuring out how does that parlay into what we need to provide our employees. What do they need during this time to feel? Do we need to have different access? Do we need to implement new additional internal controls? Do we need to switch some of the reporting responsibilities? We mentioned cyber earlier. That's critically important that we have the appropriate controls so that people feel comfortable doing their work, and so that management feels comfortable for people accessing systems. So there's a whole host of things, I think, from the qualitative and the quantitative that companies can be considering. And it's right? We're considering this in the midst of a crisis where, from an operations perspective, those people within your organization are, really trying to figure out some of this. And so again, I think we can't do it all. We need to know what makes the most sense and what's going to help us, I think, the greatest in the short term and the long term.
I'm trying to open the results. And once again, let me just try this one.
Oh, let's see.
I got it. It's okay.
Okay.
So,
I would attempt to do it, but I have the questions open. I don't know if I can do polls.
No, that's fine. I finally got brave and clicked on something. So nearly half, 47% of our respondents have already started to focus on the fraud risk management.
Great.
So, which is good. And, some think that, they'll probably do it in a month or 6 months to a year before they get started. Would you encourage them to start sooner?
I would at least start down the process of stepping back and saying, what is this environment? What new fraud risk are going to impact our business? Because fraudsters aren't going to wait around, right? It's happening right now, especially with all the money flowing. And if, from a stimulus perspective, that presents a whole, we delved into it a little bit. As a side note, if you're interested in some more on that, we've got some great resources on CARES and specific to fraud within our COVID site, Deloitte.com. But I wouldn't wait, quite honestly, too long. Again, maybe you don't have the resources and the bandwidth to go all in, but I would step back and say, what are the critical risks that are new to our organization that we may not have considered before? And how are we going to address those? I would at least start thinking there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's important too for folks to, particularly to come to realize that their employees may not normally have intended to commit a fraud or to have done something that was outside of the company's culture and values. But ethics can be very situational. It's what am I confronted with now, and what's my way to get through this? So even the folks that you think are the most honest people may, because of the fraud triangle, see rationalization or pressure or see an opportunity to do something that they might not otherwise have ever thought they would do.
That's right. Absolutely. I mean, it's just, we are in such a time of uncertainty, and I think history shows us a lot, but this is a new event, right? Each time something major happens like this, it really is, in some aspects, uncharted territory. There will be new risk. And so you're right. And people will make some choices that, that they otherwise would not have. You can't mitigate against it all, but you certainly can be thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. One of the publications or resources that we just put out on Monday talked about the importance of skepticism. And we all know that auditors, by the standards, are required to be professionally skeptical, to have a critical mindset and to evaluate evidence with that in mind, and to not just take confirming evidence, but consider disconfirming evidence. And as part of the supply chain, with the internal auditors, the audit committee members and preparers, we stress that they also have an important role to be skeptical, to ask questions like, how did this happen? And keep digging. Don't be afraid. And I think the same should apply, and probably does, to folks in the compliance team.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we hear the term professional skepticism, certainly from our side. When we think about financial and our audit and those sorts of things. And I'm a fraud specialist, so I work with a lot of our audit teams. But even internally, right, setting aside, the skepticism is important. I mean, we do need to have a kind of an increased awareness and we put on that fraudster hat to kind of think more about, we know something bad's happening, just where is it happening? Mm-hmm. It's important because if it's not happening right now, it's going to happen in the future. It's just a matter of depending upon the scheme when it surfaces.
Mm-hmm. So we're getting close to the end of our time, and I just want to ask you if we have any other questions, because I'm still challenged on that front.
Yeah, we do. So we'll try to. We've got one on third parties. We have one around remediation of risk. We have one around looking into the crystal ball, and then one around artificial intelligence. Okay. So I think with the time, we could probably go through each of those. So Margot, if you're okay with that, I'll try to,
please do.
Jump through those and then certainly chime in.
Mm-hmm. Because I'm also going to want to get your key takeaways before we wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me try to get through these. And again, I'm happy to have, if people wanted to reach out and I can get you additional information on each of these topics. I'm absolutely happy to do so. I believe our contact information is in there. But this first question was, regarding third parties, how soon do you think financial risk screening will show the effects of COVID on their business? Is it months or quarters out? I think we will start to see it almost immediate. I think that probably, maybe for some, depending upon how they report and how easily accessible their financial information is, it could be quarter. But, we're doing a lot of helping clients do a lot of risk sensing right now, which is to really start to go out and look, whether it's from social media, there's, all sorts of different databases that we're able to tap into, but really start to do some risk sensing. And that includes around third parties and the supply chain. So I think that, you will start to see the impact and be able to see some results from that almost immediately. Mm-hmm. That's another area where if you're thinking about your critical third parties and your supply chain resiliency and the financial viability of those you most rely on, I'm sure, maybe within supply chain and procurement, conversations are happening. If not, they should be, and really thinking about what is the impact and how is that business doing and how does that impact our business? Mm-hmm. They will start to see some of that pretty quickly.
And will they be there at the end of this crisis? Will they still be in business? And
if they're not, what does that mean for us?
Yeah.
Right? Do we have plans? Is there another supplier that provides what they do? Those are some of the real things. I mean, we will see some impact. So I'd say start now, don't wait. And I think you'll see results to that point of question. I think you'll see results very quickly. The next question was around, let's say you do all you can in this environment to mitigate a fraud risk, but a fraud occurs. Say it is asset misappropriation. Does this environment necessitate changes to how you remediate, or are the remediation steps generally the same? So this is a great question. There's actually kind of a couple things in here. The first is that even with everything we've said today, we can work to mitigate the risk of fraud. We all know it will happen. We cannot prevent fraud 100%. Really, quite honestly, no matter what we do, because there's always going to be the bad actors. There's always going to be choices that are made, and we cannot prevent against everything. So it will occur, right? So you've done what you can. Hopefully you're mitigating it. You've got maybe some increased detective controls in place, so it happens, but you identify it quickly. Then the question really gets to, does this environment necessitate changes to how you remediate? I think yes and no. I think if it is your typical kind of run-of-the-mill, fraud, you should continue likely to remediate the way that you have. However, I think that this environment presents an opportunity. I oftentimes see clients and companies where they remediate, which really basically means that they identified the issue, they investigated it, they disciplined the employee, or they're gone. And oftentimes we see the root cause analysis and go, okay, how did this happen? Why did this happen? How can we prevent this happening again? That should be taking place, quite honestly, regardless. But I think this environment, there's an opportunity for lessons learned and to really step back and say, okay, if this was a big one, maybe it was a small matter, but how pervasive is it? There's something that we can be doing to mitigate. We should, in theory, be doing that anyways. But I think there's an opportunity to maybe take your remediation a step further and really think about, how does this incorporate into how are we going to monitor this risk differently? Do we need to monitor it differently? It's kind of a hard question to answer. I think it's a great question. I would say if you're remediating appropriately and you're remediating thoroughly and you're doing root cause analysis and you're going back and doing some pervasive testing, or not testing, but pervasive analysis to really look at what's the impact. You definitely should keep doing that. If you're not doing some of that, probably a good time to start. Let's see. We need to consider now but what if this same issue happens in the fall? The considerations that we're giving to fraud risk now should continue, in my opinion. Meaning, this is not a one and done. I think, if we look at the health experts, everyone is telling us that we may see a second wave. And so we may see changes to how when we go back to work. I mean, it's going to look different in many instances. A lot of experts are saying that there will be a new normal. It won't go back to how it was. But when we think about mitigating risk and looking into the future, I would say the things that you're putting in place now need to carry forward. And I think you can almost assume that there will be another one. I mean, I'm not a medical expert. I've said a lot of things. I'm not a cyber. I'm not a medical, but I do think that that's something that if I were to put a crystal ball out, we're probably going to see waves of fraud as well. And I think you kind of buckle in for the long haul, especially when we think about financial reporting, disclosures, some of the going concern issues that will present, the workplace issues and morale. Those will not be solved easily or quickly.
So I wanted to was there one more question? Sorry.
There was one more question, and it was from Justine. How does AI factor into potential for fraud?
All right.
Is a great resource and tool from a data science perspective that you can use to implement, to monitor. I can talk a lot about that. I think we're kind of running out of time. Mm-hmm. Haven't considered it. Certainly do. I know many organizations, though, are not using even some of the more basic,
rudimentary,
but analytics. And so if you're not using analytics and you're not using data to monitor for the risk of fraud, considering that we're remote, that may be something that you consider. That could be a way to help you get your arms around it, given resource constraints, et cetera.
Yeah, good advice. So again, your key takeaways, what is it that you want our audience to most remember from our conversation today?
Gosh, there's a lot. I mean, I think the first one kind of says it, acknowledging that there is a heightened risk of fraud, both from just within the organization, external to the organization, and certainly from a CARES perspective. Again, we've seen it. We know it's coming. It's happening. We've already gotten, lots of inquiries about it. So just recognizing that, I think, is the first thing. Understanding that there will be a lag time. Some of these issues are not going to emerge. And so that kind of gets back to that crystal ball question a little bit. And I do think you should be in for the long game, and recognize that some of these won't present themselves. I mean, if we look at ACFE statistics, right, the normal fraud scheme is 18 months before it's detected.
Right.
So if you apply that, you're looking into 22 before some of this, or depending on your fiscal year, 22 before some of these things emerge. And so, again, I think just expecting a lag time for that, really thinking about what can we do now? What do we need to do in the long term? And identifying and addressing those emerging risks. What is new? And then what must we maintain? What must we keep our eye on? I think those would be the critical takeaways. And certainly, we could delve in and spend an hour on each of these and get the weeds. And unfortunately, we don't have that time.
Right.
Those are some of the main things. I just want to address one more question, Margot, that came in, then we'll go to that last slide, which is someone said, you stated that reporting is up. Do you mean fraud reporting or other areas of reporting? Specifically, on that comment, I was talking about reporting within a hotline. We're seeing an uptick in the number of cases that are reported. Now, those run the gamut between fraud, unethical conduct, workplace issues, human resource and talent related issues, but we're seeing an uptick in the number of reports that are coming in. So that's what I'm referring to with regards to reporting.
Okay, great. Thank you. So our last slide has links to several valuable resources. The CAQ, as I mentioned earlier, has a whole COVID resource collection. And earlier this week, we published one on managing fraud, risk culture, and skepticism during COVID. The anti-fraud collaboration publications. Last month, we put out a publication on assessing corporate culture and taking a proactive approach to deter misconduct. So I think I'm sure most of the companies on here have been doing some kind of culture assessment. It's important, I think, to continue that. And we also have a fraud and emerging tech series. And next week, we're going to publish something on data ethics and governance, and it's going to have a COVID-19 consideration in it. And then there's also Deloitte forensic focused resources, which I think you'll find very valuable and easy reading. So with that,
there's also, if you went to our website, sorry, just real quickly, there are, you can type in COVID. There's a whole host of other things that are not just fraud focused. So if you're looking for information for your organization, we've published a lot of things across really all aspects of an organization. So certainly encourage you to go out there and look at that.
Great. So thank you, Holly. This has been, for me, a very informative discussion. I hope the audience felt that same. Thank you to the audience for being here and staying engaged. And most importantly, I want to thank the ECI IMPACT team, who's done an amazing job turning this conference into an online event. Kudos to everyone who has scrambled over the last several weeks to get this up and running. So many of the sessions touched on the importance of culture inside of an organization. We focused primarily on risk, but as you probably noticed, culture kept coming up as one of the risks that you need to pay attention to. It shouldn't be dismissed just because nobody's in the office together anymore. So important in this time of mandated work from home to reach out and do well-being checks, I guess is what they're calling them, on your employees to have them stay connected, have check-ins, and be flexible in terms of how they have to work because everybody is at home now. They're teenagers, their daycare centers are closed, et cetera. So, be flexible, but also, as I would like to say, keep your eye on the ball because risk of fraud and misconduct can percolate up anywhere. So be sure to continue communicating with your organizations. And with that, I want to say thank you to everybody and stay safe.